if your house was consumed by fire and your child was trapped inside, a firefighter said, I'm going in to get your kid, you would not stop the firefighter and say, this is my decision, I'm going to go in and do it. We need to start thinking that way about bipolar disorder. It is a 5-alarm fire. You may need to say, look, my son is not going to listen to me. He's not going to listen to me because I'm his mom, I'm his dad. You know what? But he'll listen to you because he loves his Aunt Linda. Have them do the talking and the partnering, and you take a less active role. You called 911. You got the firefighter there. You told the firefighter that your child was trapped in the back bedroom, which is through the front door, directly to the left and down the hall. You've done a lot. And when it comes to mental illness, because of the stigma, the discrimination, and the shame, often parents take this all on their own. And unfortunately, they're ill-equipped to handle it. And bipolar disorder just literally consumes them.
Welcome to Hope Starts With Us, a podcast by NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. My name is Dan Gillison. I'm the CEO for NAMI and your host. NAMI started this podcast because we believe that hope starts with us. Hope starts with us talking about mental health. Hope starts with us making information accessible. Hope starts with us providing resources and practical advice. Hope starts with us sharing our stories. And last, hope starts with us breaking the stigma. If you or a loved one is struggling with a mental health condition and have been looking for hope, we made this podcast for you. Hope starts with all of us. Hope is a collective. We hope that each episode with each conversation brings you into that collective to know you are not alone. March 30th is World Bipolar Day, and I'm honored to speak with Gabe Howard about living with bipolar disorder and his experiences. Gabe is an award-winning podcast host, author, and speaker, but as he'll tell you himself, he wouldn't be any of those things without his experiences with mental health awareness and living with bipolar disorder. He has shared his story across several platforms, including ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, and as a speaker at Oxford University. Gabe is an author of Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations, and the host of HelpLine's Inside Mental Health and Inside Bipolar podcasts. He has even hosted NAMI's own Dr. Ken Duckworth as a podcast guest. Gabe, sincerely, we just want to say thank you for taking your time to join us and our audience today on our podcast.
Oh, it is an absolute honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for what you do every day. Thank you. And I want to start off by saying that I really deeply enjoyed hearing your story and learning your experiences when we met in November last year, because I really do think it was incredibly impactful. You had everyone on the edge of their seat. It was so really authentic, Gabe. So often we judge a book by its cover. And we see this cover and we don't know the table of contents and the chapters and verse. So we were moved. And I'm hoping you would be willing to share and to give our audience some background about your life and how you've come to be such a prolific speaker, author, and podcast host.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. First, that was a great event. The National Press Club in DC. I never thought that somebody with bipolar disorder, me, would just get an opportunity like that. So I'm glad to see it going in that direction because, on one hand, there's always a criticism. It's like, oh, well, they had like 7 speakers and only one person had bipolar disorder. So they got, they're talking about us without us. And I do get that. Right. But I got to tell you, when I started my advocacy 15 years ago, there were 7 speakers, none of them had mental illness. I was the only one, or there was nobody. So now I'm the only one, but it's better. And I think that's growing. I just really felt like I needed to say that.
Well, no, if I can interact, We're going to make this to our audience. Gabe and I are going to make this podcast very interactive. So it's not going to be me giving input to Gabe and then output. We're going to interact. We're going to tell the audience that now because we're kindred spirits. Gabe, what you just said is a part of our mantra, nothing about us without us, first of all. And the other part of it is that you are not alone. And what you just said about the 1 to 7 is incredible. That ratio, we have to fix it. Now, kudos to the National Press Club and kudos to our host that was sponsoring the event for the standpoint of making sure that the lived experience was included. However, we do need, to your point, that ratio needs to change. Yes, years ago, there wouldn't have even been one. But right now in 2024 and 2023, coming into 2024, we need to make sure that there's 2, 3, 4, that there's balance in these opportunities, that it's not 1 in 7. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it was so cool to meet you at the press club. I had not had the pleasure before. Certainly had heard your voice. And then all of a sudden I'm like, that's Gabe Howard. So, and by the way, not to say anything about myself or my peers that were panelists there as I was, the panelists I remember, the conversation I remember is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. You used a word there that I want to make sure that the audience hears, and that's balance. So often in these conversations, people are like, well, it should only be people with mental illness on that stage. I'm like, no, that's wrong. And then, of course, it can shift the other way. It should only be experts. It should only be doctors and medical. No, that's wrong. Okay, it should only be family members because they know. No, that's also wrong. We have to strike that balance. And I do think we're getting better. I want to point that out. I want to say we are getting better, but I don't think we're there yet. So two things can be true. I am excited that we are getting better. And it is also true that I think we need to do more. Yeah, it was a really, really cool event. I feel like we should tell the audience who the hell I am. And also, I remember on the thing, it said, don't swear. But, you did say asshole. So I feel like we've gone off the rails a little bit, but I feel like we're in a good place. Right, Dan?
Let's go, man. This is good. I'm in a good place, and I know you are. And we need the audience to know a little bit about Gabe, Gabriel Howard. I mean, tell them who you are, buddy. You certainly told us at the press club, and our audience will absolutely enjoy it.
Thank you. So I live with bipolar disorder. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder back in 2003. And if you would have asked me 24 hours before I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital if I had any mental illness whatsoever, I would have told you absolutely not. And this is despite the fact that I had racing thoughts, despite the fact that I had grandiosity, despite the fact that I experienced hypersexuality, despite the fact that I had thought about suicide every single day for my entire life, despite the fact that I experienced mania, depression, despite the fact that some days I thought I was a god and some days I thought that I was garbage. Like, I really honestly believed that my mother would be proud of me if I completed suicide. I believed all of these things. The other thing that I believed is that mental illness is what happened to bad people. It happened to bad families, right? If you came from a bad family, you were crazy, which is the really correct way to say mental illness. Mental illness is just this PC word that we throw around. They're actually nuts. They're nuts. I espoused all of that. And I point that out because I want people to be patient with the people who still believe this. I was one of those people who believed it. I was 25 years old. I had a job. I owned a house. I was a taxpayer. And I fell into that trap at my own peril. When I woke up in that psychiatric hospital and they're like, you have bipolar disorder, obviously my first question was, what's bipolar disorder? And they gave me a little pamphlet. It wasn't great, but it was there. And I read it and I recognized myself. The highs and lows, the mood swings, the grandiosity, the spending all of my money, all of the hallmarks were there. And I thought, you're telling me the reason that I'm doing this is because of a disorder? That's good and bad all at the same time. And then I started learning from the people around me, both from peers who were in the peer support groups that I was going to, of course, the doctors who were educating me about the illness, the social workers and case managers who were meeting with me. And I just really realized pretty quickly, Dan, that it turns out that people don't think about suicide every day of their life, that I was unusual and abnormal in this thinking. And it really started making me think, this is so incredibly sad. I've been doing this for 25 years. Why did nobody stop me? I promised to step down off the soapbox after this, but I want to be very clear. I come from a good family. Mom and dad loved me. We ate dinner together. It was a stable household. I had health insurance. I called my family immediately upon being admitted to a psychiatric hospital. I wasn't trying to hide it from them. They came from Tennessee, where they lived, to Ohio, where I was, almost immediately to render support, aid, and care. This is where they found NAMI, because they were just like, we don't know what's going on. And they started calling therapists out of the phone book saying, we need to learn about bipolar. And finally, after a few calls, one of them said, you need to call NAMI and take the friends and family class, which is the family to family class. But back then, apparently it was called the friends and family class. Back then it was also 12 weeks. My mother points out that now it's less.
Wow. Wow. That is awesome. And you know what? It does take community. And thank you for sharing your story. And your site mentions that if you hadn't been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, you wouldn't be where you are today. How has living openly with bipolar impacted your life? And have you experienced the impact of mental health stigma?
So Dan, I got to tell you, these are always really difficult questions to ask because there's always that phrase out there that says, if you're happy where you are, it means whatever path you had to walk to get there was worth it. And I'm one of these pessimistic people that thinks that that's stupid. I think that's just so incredibly privileged thing to say. So you're telling me that every abuse victim that overcame the abuse was worth it because they overcame it? And that's how I really feel. I feel like an abuse victim, except my abuser was an illness. It was a disease. It was bipolar disorder. And I don't think that the path was worth it. You cannot deny that when I make my living as a bipolar speaker and podcaster and mental health advocate, that wasn't strongly formed and shaped by the fact that I live with bipolar disorder. And I've met so many incredible people along the way. And it is not lost on me that I would have not been invited to Oxford to speak if I would have stayed in IT. If I was still working as a NOC supervisor, that's Network Operations Center, making sure that your credit card payments went through or that your electric stayed on or whatever NOC I was working on at the time, Oxford would have had no interest in talking to me. And I've met so many incredible friends along the way. So it's a difficult thing for me to say, but it absolutely inspired me and it influenced me. And I really, truly believe, Dan, that it made me a more well-rounded person. I don't know that I would have understood the plight of people outside of myself. I'm not sure that I still understand the plight of people outside of myself, but I do believe that I'm trying now in a way that I wasn't trying before. You asked about stigma. When I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I had a job, which was good because it means I had health insurance. And I was off work for 6 weeks. And when I came back from work, somebody told me that I faked the suicide so that I could get a paid vacation, faked the suicide attempt, the suicide ideation, et cetera, that I made it all up, that I just wanted to get free vacation so I could claim this, go to rehab. That's what they called it. I'm making air quotes. They called it rehab, not me. And I would get paid for doing nothing. And then I could push my work off on them. That's the first thing I heard when I got back. It got worse from there. You know, I was under a lot of pressure and stress. I'm trying to acclimate to medications, which have a brutal side effect profile. So in the early days, I can honestly say the treatment was worse than the illness. If for no other reason than at least I was used to living with bipolar disorder, I wasn't used to living with the side effects of these medications. They were new to me. I like to stop here, and I'm not trying to be graphic, but the side effect profiles are lethargy. You literally can't move for 24 hours or longer. Things like anal leakage. These are not sexy side effects, and you're trying to deal with them on top of living your daily life and getting used to managing an illness. So there was a lot going on, and this impacted my coworkers. So once again, I want to be clear. This did impact my coworkers. They no longer had the intelligent, reliable, stable person who they were used to. They had this mess of a problem on their hands. But they revolted and they decided that they didn't want to work with me anymore. And the place where I worked had a decision to make. They could get rid of me and keep the other 25 people, or they could get rid of the 25 people and keep me. They decided to get rid of me. Now, this is very problematic because I was very sick. And since I lost my job, I no longer have health insurance. So I was really left in a very vulnerable position that was difficult to work itself out. I don't want to fall down a rabbit hole and explain how it worked itself out, but I lost my job. I lost the last thing that I had that frankly made me a functional human being. I'm now unemployed. I'm now having money problems. I'm now having health insurance problems. And I'm scared on top of everything else. That's probably the worst stigma that I ever felt, just because it was so immediately impactful.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And, your resiliency. And I don't know how you feel about that word resiliency. It would be interesting to get your perspective on that, because it's one of those cosmetic kind of things we say all the time. But just your fortitude is real. So, we know that living with mental illness, Gabe, can provide challenges for anyone, especially when they're first receiving that diagnosis. As someone living with bipolar disorder, what was it like to learn more about your diagnosis? How did you come to terms with it? And what led you to the success that you've experienced, if we can call it success?
Yeah, it's a bizarre journey. On one hand, I accepted it right away. We always hear these cautionary tales of people with severe and persistent mental illness that go off their medications. I never went off my medications, or that refuse to accept the diagnosis and say, I'm just fine. I never did that. I was really very fortunate, probably because of strong family support, probably because I was a little older. I was 25, probably because, I looked back and I saw the symptoms so clearly. It was like, oh my God, I do that. I thought that was just my personality. It came so clear to me so quickly. But at the same time, this is really the only way that I can describe it, Dan. I went from a white male with all the privilege that society has to offer to a crazy person with none of the privilege that society has to offer, except that I would like to point out that if you have to be a crazy person, you should still try to be a white male. It was a lot. It was a lot to wrap my mind around, especially since I wasn't really used to adversity. I was very successful right out of school. I made a lot of money. I was very intelligent. I was married. I had nice cars. I lived in a nice house, and all of this from a fairly young age. Bipolar disorder was the first real adversity that I ever faced in my life. And it's a biggie. I mean, it's a biggie. I appreciate you calling me resilient, and I have a love-hate relationship with the word, as you kind of alluded to, but I've seen bipolar disorder and serious and persistent mental illness take out people far stronger than me. So I don't know exactly how I was successful, except to say slow and steady wins the race. I think this all the time. I was very fortunate to be able to break it down into small, manageable chunks. Today, I'm just going to focus on X. Today, I'm just going to focus on Y. And then at some future date, I'm going to put those two things together. But I had a lot of protective factors. As I said, I had very supportive friends and family. I had the resources to not work. I was able to get the insurance thing figured out with frankly, family support. I was able to keep moving forward in a way that unfortunately a lot of my peers are not.
Yeah, you mentioned the protective factors. You mentioned the family and having community, and you mentioned you were smart. I want to challenge that and say, no, you're very smart, Gabe. And a part of this is just indicated by your matriculation through university, as they say, but also in terms of work and working in a network operations center. You have to have some skills, some competencies, and some attributes that brings you into that space. Not everybody gets in that space, so kudos to you for that. And you also mentioned almost like the haves and the have-nots. And then if you're going to experience this, looking this way is different than looking that way, which led me to the social determinants of health and then the social determinants of mental health. I know this is off script, but can you talk about the social determinants of mental health and what your experience has been as this advocate and national spokesperson in this space?
So I love telling this story. Pretend that your first car is a Mercedes-Benz, the $200,000 Mercedes-Benz. That's your first car. You've never driven any other car before, and for the purposes of this story, you've never even ridden in another car before. Just this $200,000 Mercedes-Benz. You get in the car, you drive it around for a couple of weeks, and then you decide, oh my God, this is so terrible, I need to fix it. I need to fix it. People cannot be expected to drive this $200,000 hunk of junk. We must do better. So imagine my surprise when I realized that not everybody has a $200,000 car. Imagine my surprise when I find out that not everybody has a new car. Imagine my surprise when I find out that not everybody has a car at all. And then imagine my surprise that even the people who don't have cars, not all of them have access to public transportation. Now, the analogy here is mental health care. I had the $200,000 Mercedes version of mental health care, right? I was in a big city, a bed was opened, I had great doctors, I was able to move into a step-down program, I had no problem finding a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a peer support group. I had no problem finding a NAMI, not only in my hometown, but in my parents' hometown, which was 700 miles away in Tennessee. And of course, I had my family, and I had money, and I had health insurance. And after I went through that, I thought to myself, this is so messed up. This is so incredibly messed up that I have to stand up and fix it. And that's what was going through my mind. It was almost grandiose thinking, because I was like, this is unacceptable on every level. And then I found out that I had the best of the best of the best. I had the $200,000 Mercedes. And then I started meeting people that didn't have a Mercedes at all. They had whatever other car is crappy. I don't want to offend people and their cars. And I was like, I can't believe this. And then I found out that your zip code determines the type of mental health care that you have access to. And then I found out that your age, gender, sexual orientation, race, all determines your outcomes. Why on earth are any of these things in the equation? This is the most offensive thing that I have ever seen whatsoever, where a group of people can sit in a room and say, all right, here are the outcomes based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, and where you live. And if that thing isn't within a margin of error that is reasonable, a statistical tie, as statistics would say, you should rightly be offended and want to know what is happening to the marginalized groups. But instead, we're just like, hey, these are just the facts. What are you going to do? Listen, I lack words. Gabe Howard, do not have the words to adequately describe my frustration and anger that this is allowed to continue, and it has continued my entire career, which is going on almost 20 years now. And we're not any closer to fixing it than we were 20 years ago. So you can just, that's what I got to say there, Dan.
No, I appreciate it, Gabe. And, we talked about as we went into COVID that the mental health system was fragmented. And I would offer to you, if it was fragmented when we went into COVID and even long before COVID, what is it as we've come out of COVID? The other part of that is that if we think about Katrina and what happened in New Orleans, the Army Corps of Engineers would tell anyone that would listen for years prior to the levees breaking that if we have a Cat 5 storm here, then the levees will not hold. The levees will not hold. So we were told in advance. So our levees have broken in mental health. That's where we are. And we were told that it was fragmented before. So the question is the way forward. And thank you, because your voice is so critical to this. And you're right. It's 20 years. And one of the old adages is if we do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got. So how do we build this collaboration? How do we come at it in a new way? So I'm interested in getting your thoughts on that in terms of what are your thoughts on how do we go about it? But hold that thought. And I want to go to the next scripted question, which is when someone first begins to understand a new diagnosis, there is a lot of information to digest. Is there anything you wish you had known when you received your diagnosis? As you go back and you play it back, it's almost like that after action report or the continuous improvement models. What would you have? Is there anything you wish you would have known when you received your diagnosis? And does that contribute? How does that contribute to your desires to share your story with others?
The number one thing that I wish I would have known is that the term just be med compliant and you'll be fine is complete BS. We say this over and over and over again. Just take your meds, just take your meds, just be med compliant. And there's a word missing from that. You have to be med compliant on the correct medications. Actually, it's not a word. There's a whole phrase, right? Being med compliant it's not a protective factor in any way, because if it was, all we would have to do is find one psychiatrist to write every single person with serious and persistent mental illness a prescription for one M&M a day. And then as long as that person was med compliant and ate that M&M, this entire mental health crisis would be solved. NAMI could shut its doors. We wouldn't need to do this anymore. Now, any reasonable person is like, Gabe, that's stupid. You can't just give people with mental illness an M&M and think they're going to be fine. All right, that is stupid. I completely agree. But yet when you say, well, if they would just take their medicine, they'd be fine, you think that's reasonable. It's equally stupid because doctors aren't magic. People with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis, people who are actively hallucinating, they don't just walk up to a doctor who hands them a magic pill and suddenly they're better. But we keep putting the onus on the sick people. Whenever they're not doing well, oh, it's because they're not med compliant. Oh, it's because they're not following their doctor's orders. Oh, it's because they're not trying hard enough. Oh, it's because they lack insight. It's always something that blames the sick person. It never blames the doctor. It never blames the pharmaceutical companies. It never blames society. It's always Gabe's fault. I wish I would have known that because I was stupid med compliant. Oh my God. Not only did I take my pills every morning and every night, I took them at the exact same time. I was determined to beat this. I wanted a good life. I wanted to get back to the life I had. I wanted to get my power back, my authority back. I wanted everything back. I did everything right. And yet it still took 4 years. Why? If I was med compliant on day one, shouldn't it have taken, like 6 weeks? I mean, how long does it take these pills to reach efficacy levels? Like 6 to 8 weeks? So I bring this all back because I blame myself too. Remember, I'm a member of the same society. I absorb the same messages. I thought I wasn't trying hard enough. I thought I wasn't working hard enough. I thought it was my fault. And remember, I'm already prone to paranoia. I'm already prone to anxiety. I'm already prone to depression. So I just started beating myself up with a Rocky level skill set because I could not fathom that it was anybody's fault other than my own. And I'm already in a very vulnerable position. I wish I would have known on day one, Dan, that this takes a long time. It takes a very long time. You don't get diagnosed with serious and persistent mental illness, go to the doctor a couple of times, get some pills, and be fine. It just doesn't work that way. And one of the ways you asked how it impacted my advocacy, I have made it a point to tell this story to everybody I could find. And people do roll their eyes when I say the M&M thing. But once again, I do not believe it is any more ridiculous than the idea that a loved one can be diagnosed with a serious medical condition and all they have to do is what the doctor says and they'll be fine. It defies all logic that we believe that. And it's a message that unfortunately gets pushed out over and over and over again by well-intentioned and very caring people. And I think we need to do a better job to nuance that message and explain that you need to be med compliant on the correct medications and with the correct medical treatments and with the correct resources. And then, and only then, do you have a shot at wellness.
Thank you, Gabe. And something that you said at the beginning that is interesting is that you mentioned that you and your family found NAMI. You said you were also fortunate because NAMI was where you lived and also where your parents lived. What did NAMI mean to you and your family from the standpoint of our support groups? And you mentioned family and friends or family to family, which was 12 weeks and is now 8 weeks. What was that like? And what would the journey have been like if that had not been there?
My parents were desperate for information. That's really what it came down to. We believed that mental illness happened to bad families. So since we were a good family, my parents had zero information on this. Then they have a son who's diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So like any good parent, they want to know as much information as possible. Now, first and foremost, you got to go back to 2003. There wasn't a lot of podcasts. The World Wide Web was a very different place. The internet, we didn't all have phones in our pockets and things like that. So it was more difficult to find resources. And they were trying to go to the library and dig up resources, but it just wasn't really written in a way that they could understand. And that's when my mom thought, well, I'm just going to make an appointment with a psychologist. And even if we have to, go to a couple appointments and just talk about my son's bipolar disorder, that's going to work. Well, it's really difficult to get in with a psychologist. They have huge waiting lists. When they said, what do you want to be seen for? My mom was very honest. And she's like, I want to talk about my son's bipolar disorder. And they're like, oh, are you suffering? They're like, no, I literally want to know what the hell bipolar disorder is. They always said no then. They're like, no, this is for therapy, not a learning session. But my mom was persistent. And eventually somebody said, no, you need NAMI. You need a class. And my mom's like, yes, that I swear I've been telling people that. So she calls up the local NAMI, and again, they recommend the friends and family, which was now family to family, and it was a 12-week course. And she took the course and she learned all of these things. And because she had that knowledge, because my grandmother had that knowledge, because my father and my grandfather had this knowledge, and then therefore my siblings had this knowledge, they had a better chance of doing the right thing when I needed them to do the right thing. And I want to be clear, I always phrase it as better chance because they didn't always do the right thing. NAMI's not magic. Taking a class doesn't make you perfect. It's foundational knowledge. But remember, they believed that this was all made up, or it happens to bad families, or that mentally ill people are violent. I mean, they just believed so many things. There was no concept whatsoever that this could happen to us. That's where we were. So when you ask what NAMI did for them, it gave them literally all of their reasonable, factual, and actual knowledge about mental illness. And of course, what they were most interested in was bipolar disorder. But there's also a second thing that it did. It gave them people, right? My parents were afraid to talk to people. They brought it up to a few people. My son was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Oh, I always knew he was weird. What do you mean you always knew he was weird? That's my son you're talking about. Well, whatever. You know what Gabe has could be resolved with a good spanking. He's 26. I don't. What are you talking about? So when they got to NAMI, they found like-minded people. My son has bipolar disorder. So does mine. Oh, okay. Well, that's a different answer than my mother was used to getting. It's not fair to call it abuse. That's probably that's not the right word. But my mom took the brunt of this. Right. Once again, I'm almost 50 years old. I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s. There was this strong, if something is wrong with your kid, it's because the mom screwed up. So my mom took the blame for what bipolar disorder did for decades. She just took it because she's like, well, I'm a mom. I got to take it. That's what I do. She believed that she was responsible for this. People believed that she was responsible for this. So my mother went through a lot as well that I didn't find out until years later in advocacy when she overheard me talking about a podcast once. And I said something about her experience and she said, that's not true, right? And I said, what do you mean it's not true? And she filled me in. So once again, going back to a previous question, one of the things that this career has also given me is vast insight to what my family went through. Because a lot of people, when they reach recovery, they kind of put it behind them and they just kind of move on with their lives. I've really had an opportunity to delve. I know that's kind of the longest question to how did NAMI help, but where else are you going to get knowledge? Dan, I'm serious. Now it's, we've got, Mental Health America, we've got the DBSA, we've got the internet, we've got podcasts, but NAMI was the only game in town when they started. I'm glad that there's more resources, but I think you and I can both agree we haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg of needed resources.
No, I absolutely agree. And one of the most powerful things you said in talking about the connection with NAMI is what it gave your family and your mom. It gave them people.
It did.
It gave them people. And that's so powerful. We like to say at NAMI that we're a collective, we're a community, we're a collaborator, and we're a convener. Because that's what we do is we bring the people together so that your mom is sitting there and saying, wait a minute, your son, your daughter, oh my gosh, I'm in a community and I'm not living this by myself. And it's almost like a revelation. So thank you for sharing that, Gabe.
You're very welcome.
On your podcast, Inside Bipolar, you recently hosted an episode asking the question, is I'm bipolar's a stigmatizing statement? At NAMI, we use first-person language as often as possible, but I'm curious where you land on this question. Do you feel I'm bipolar adds to or reduces stigma?
First off, Dan, thank you for asking the question, but I want to tell you it's rife with controversy. It is fascinating to me that when we talk about how to discuss something, that's where all the controversy is. The fact that the suicide rate has largely remained unchanged, there's not enough bed, that homeless is exploding, right? There's no controversy there, but we're all really angry at the words that we use to describe the problem. And I got to tell you, that is where I sort of leave the conversation. I don't even think this is in the top 10 problems that people with mental illness have. How we're referred, I got to tell you, there's this piece of me, and it's the snarky piece of me that is like, you know what? You can call me anything you want if you fully fund the mental health safety net. You can call me a jackhole jerk face if I have access to all the resources that I need so that my chances of getting better are damn near 100%. I mean, will it suck to be perfectly well and you call me a jackhole jerk face? Sure. But you know what? I'll be stable. I'll have a job. I'll have a spouse. I'll own a house. And I'm probably not going to care what you're calling me because I'm going to be too busy living my life in wellness. But instead of focusing our attention there, we're trying to decide how to talk about it. I personally do not think the phrase "I'm bipolar" is stigmatizing. Now, the context might be, for example, I say all the time, "I'm bipolar, I'm bipolar." And people come up to me and they say, "Gabe, you're so much more than just bipolar." And I stop them right there and I say, "Why did you hear the word just?" I didn't say just. I said, "I am bipolar," which I am. And they're like, "But you're not just bipolar." I'm like, I heard you. You're not hearing me. Now, that said, if I say, "Hey, Gabe is bipolar," and Gabe says to me, "Please don't call me bipolar. Please say that I'm a person living with bipolar," then I would immediately apologize and say, "Of course, absolutely, no problem. I have no issue with that." I believe that people should define their own experiences. They should define how they want to address themselves. If I want to call myself bipolar, that is my personal decision. And it sort of bothers me when people are telling me how to describe my own life. That's what hits me. And I have never once told somebody to not use person first language. I have never once corrected the way that somebody talks about themselves. And I do think, for what it's worth, that person first language has a place. I think it is an excellent resource for media. When they are writing about illnesses, I think that's a great place for person first language. But it just creeps into so many different places. And this is the last thing that I want to say, Dan, because this is what really impacts me the most. People don't lie awake at night and wonder if they're having a mental health crisis. People wonder if they're going effing crazy. People wonder if they're going nuts. People wonder if they're going insane. And you think that crazy, nuts, insane, and then there was the F word, right? That's not the way to talk about that. Do you think they have this language? They're sick and they're scared. And you're worried that they said crazy or nuts or insane? We're putting the focus in the wrong area. But that said, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think there's places where it belongs, but I think it's become this all-encompassing thing that, frankly, just it sucks up too many resources and we spend too much time talking about it. And I would like to see that changed. And I don't think that the context is always negative. And finally, to wrap this up in a nice little bow, I mentioned that I was fired from my job. They said absolutely nothing stigmatizing. Nothing. I've read all the reports. It was written by lawyers. They used all the correct language. They said nothing stigmatizing. They addressed everything beautifully. The language police would be proud, but they still fired me and took my job and health insurance. So I'm much more concerned with that. If they would have let me keep my job but called me the bipolar, I would have been in a much better place than them taking my job, taking my health insurance, but referring to me as the person who lives with bipolar. And that's the deal that a lot of us are really considering when we think about this language debate. Is it the most important thing on our plate right now?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Gabe. That's so powerful in terms of saying, okay, let's focus on what's important here. So the next question I have for you, Gabe, and thank you. This is very interactive and very good. Where do you see the conversation surrounding bipolar disorder and mental health at large evolving? And do you believe efforts like your podcast are having the impact you have hoped they would?
When I look at initiatives like my podcast, I think they are having an impact. Are they having the impact that I hope they would? If I'm being honest, no. And here's why. Because they're still preaching to the choir. The people who listen to the podcast define as people either living with bipolar disorder or who love somebody with bipolar disorder. I want to live in a world where somebody says, this could impact me or somebody I love, so I'm going to listen to a couple of episodes of this. Or I want to live in a world where when something about bipolar disorder or serious and persistent mental illness comes on, even if it's not impacting them or anybody they know, they think, this is something that I should be educated about. We're still not there. So in that way, it's not having the impact that I hoped it would have. But in another way, again, I remember when I was diagnosed 20 years ago, it was very difficult to find information about bipolar disorder. Remember, I was diagnosed before there was social media. So I couldn't join a Reddit thread or a private Facebook group and find a group. I had to do it in person. Now, I was very fortunate. I was in a big city and I drove. So I joined a group called the Bipolar Bears. And every week it was all people who lived with bipolar disorder. It was a support group for an hour and a half. And I should mention initiatives like NAMI Connections were either just starting or not quite out yet. And NAMI Connections was not in my city. So that was a support group that I didn't have the opportunity to go to yet. So when I was first diagnosed, there just wasn't a quick and easy way to meet up with a group of people real quick. So in this way, podcasts like mine, if it's 3 a.m., and you're wondering if you're, and I'm making air quotes, going crazy, and you think, well, a doctor did say that I was bipolar, and you Google, how do I know if I have bipolar disorder? And you see my podcast and you look through the things, and one of them is, I just found out that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and I'm scared, and you hit play, and then I'm in your ear. You know, I'm like, hey, my name is Gabe and I live with bipolar disorder. My name is Dr. Nicole Washington and I'm a board certified psychiatrist who treats bipolar disorder. And then we start talking about how it's reasonable to be scared, how it's okay. Here's some action steps that you can take. And one of the things that I personally love about podcasts is it's a very intimate medium. It's designed to feel like you're eavesdropping on a conversation, right? All the people listening right now, they're sitting at the table next to us, right? And they're just listening to Gabe and Dan talk. And I think this is interesting. And that feels some way. And I know in my initial diagnosis, I felt lost. I felt misunderstood. And I felt like I didn't have anybody. And in that way, yes, I think the podcast and other initiatives, it's not just the podcast, it's other things like online support groups. And while they can be dangerous, I always want to put that asterisk up. Obviously, if you get the wrong podcast, the wrong support group, the wrong information, it can lead to things like, oh, the CBD oil I buy at the gas station will cure schizophrenia. We have that problem. But if you find the right resources, and my resources are the right resources, not because I think that you should agree with me, but because they're medically checked. They're medically reviewed. They're put out by HelpLine Media. You're more than welcome to disagree with my opinion. You're more than welcome to disagree with my delivery, but you will never be able to disagree with my facts because they are facts. And if something changes, we immediately correct it. Research is always ongoing, and we have the ability to do that. So these are things that I'm very, very proud of. But no, we have so much further to go.
Yeah, as well you should be, and it's a lot to be proud of. Gabe, this has been so impactful, and we always wrap up each week. We dedicate the last couple of minutes of our podcast for a special section called "Hold On to Hope." You clearly are dedicated to sharing your experience and supporting the community of individuals living with bipolar disorder, and I'm sure that sometimes it's harder to continue pushing against the stigma surrounding mental health conversations. So with that said, what helps you hold on to hope?
It's always so hard when you think about these questions, because sometimes I want to answer it by saying my wife, right? I'm very, once I got stable, I got married and I got a great wife, right? We've been married for 12 years. I'm twice divorced, right? Which is not an uncommon story for people with bipolar disorder. So, and my wife is one of the most positive people I know, to the point where it's annoying. You can't help but give that answer, right? But sometimes I also like to point out, I don't always hold on to hope. Sometimes I let it go and I hope it finds me again. The fact that it always finds me again actually gives me a lot of hope because when I want to give up, it's just like, it just comes back. And then I look around at other people. I'm very fortunate in this job, right? I get to talk to people all over the country in different places, in different situations, in different towns, in different age groups. And I listen to their stories and I get to ask them questions and I think, wow, like that's amazing. How did you do that? And that gives me hope. The fact that we're still talking about this 20 years later, or the fact that I'm still talking about this 20 years later, gives me a lot of hope. I thought about this question a lot because you gave it to me in advance. And I thought, well, I'm not going to stumble around and bumble. I'm going to have a nice, great answer. And that was the wife one. But if I'm being like perfectly honest, I think there's just so many things that converge that give me hope. And I really want to say that even with all of those things, sometimes I do lose hope. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay because it always finds me again. And the thing that probably gives me the most hope is my ability to be open to the fact that hope will come back when I let it go.
Gabe, you said so much there, and hope finds me at the most opportune moments when you're not feeling hopeful. And that's incredible. And to your bride of 12 years, kudos. And it's incredibly important to have that support system and to have that partner. And it's about trust and it's about community. So thank you. But hope finds me. I appreciate that. And, this has been fantastic. Do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up, Gabe, that you'd want to share with the audience?
I have so many closing thoughts. Listen, I believe that recovery it's going to look different for everybody, right? And in order for recovery to truly work, you have to buy in. And I talk to so many people who are, they're like, hey, I told my loved one what they needed to do and they won't do it. And I'm like, that's not going to work. You can't do it for them. And if I want to leave the audience with anything, it's that if you love somebody with serious and persistent mental illness, you got to really evaluate what you're doing and ask yourselves two questions, like two real hard, honest questions. One, is it working? That's the first really hard question. Is what you are doing working? And the second question is, will it work in the long term? Once you stop doing whatever you're doing, is it going to still work? And the reason I point that out is because so often we build systems of care around this idea that we're going to be able to care for people forever. But then as soon as we stop providing those resources, they relapse. And then we say like, oh no, the mental health safety net is broken. It's not broken. It worked exactly what it was built to do. It was built to stabilize people and then let them go. It stabilized them and it let them go. When people say the mental health safety net is broken, how do you figure? It was never meant to sustain people for their lifetimes, and it was never meant to release them when they were well. It was only meant to release them when they were stable. I think that we need to take that example and apply it to our own situations. One of the things that was very, very helpful in my care was it was self-directed. The things that I felt comfortable with, we did. The things that I didn't feel comfortable with, we didn't do. And it was very hard sometimes for my parents and my friends and family to step back and they're like, he's going to fail. He's going to land on his butt. It's going to hurt him. But they did. They let me fail so that I could pick myself up and learn from it. I do want to build off that and say, this is an easier said than done thing, right? It's so easy to get on a podcast with a microphone in front of you and say, hey, your loved ones, just let them go and it'll all turn out okay. And I want to say that too, because sometimes I hate giving these closing remarks and these like last bit of advice or something that I want people to do, because any reasonable person can roll their eyes and say, that's not going to work in my community or my family or with my loved one. It goes back to the conversation that we had before, which is, yeah, it might not. This is my honest to gosh last statement. I just want people to keep a very open mind. Take what you want and leave the rest. NAMI says that all the time, right? Approach this like a buffet. Take what you want and leave the rest. But Gabe had to put a little twist on it, right? When you go to a buffet, you take what you want and you leave the rest. You don't stand in front of the food that you don't like and point at it and scream how much you hate it and how that food needs to be taken off the buffet and how you're not going to tolerate that food being next to the food that you like. Nobody behaves that way, but yet we do in advocacy all the time. We're telling other people not to do things because it didn't work for us or our loved ones. Take what you want, leave the rest. Don't stand in front of food that you don't like, screaming about how you don't like it.
This comes down to something we say about meet people where they are, not where we want them to be.
Yes.
Not where we want them to be. And you're so authentic. And yes, this is the wrap up, but Gabe, that can't be your last word. I got to ask you another question.
All right.
If I can,
You
if that's
can,
okay
you may,
with
absolutely.
you. And you can tell me, no, Dan, a family, they've got a young adult. And there's this situation similar to yours. Their young adult is prospering, doing well, and all of a sudden, he or she's been diagnosed as bipolar, and they don't know where to go, what to do. You've probably done this on your podcast so many times in terms of that first initial situation. Would you share some of those initial kinds of thoughts of that family that's just learning and they have a young adult in their early 20s?
Yeah. So the first thing is families tend to blame themselves. Whenever it comes to mental illness, families are like, it's all my fault. We did it. I caused it. Remember when I talked about my mother earlier in the show? She felt that everything that I did was somehow her fault. This is a very stereotypically parental thing to do. Arguably, it's a very stereotypically mom thing to do. But parents often take responsibility for things that are frankly just outside of their control. So the first thing I would say is you need to take a deep breath and recognize this is nobody's fault. It is nobody's fault. However, we now have to decide whose responsibility it is. And it's the responsibility of the person who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, right? They're the coach. But you can take on some of that responsibility by being a good teammate. Now, I'm going to get as much as I can out of this sports analogy. If they're the coach and you're the teammate, it means you have to do what the coach says. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, coach, XYZ, and hope the coach changes his mind. Doesn't mean that you can't call an audible, for example, in the case of danger, suicide, if they're going to be a danger to themselves or others, right? But you have to have this general resting point that they're in charge. And if you keep that in mind, it changes the way that you approach things. You don't say things like, you need to go to the doctor. You say things like, I think that you would benefit from going to a doctor. How can I help you get there? I would really like to see you go to therapy. If I go with you, will you go? You start making deals like that, right? You can't order somebody. Remember, you said adult child. I don't know of any adult child, bipolar disorder or not, that's going to start taking orders from mom and dad. There's a reason that we want to be adults. It's so we can make our own decisions. And I always point back to those parents and I'm like, hey, if another adult ordered you to do something, wouldn't you just not do it out of, like inserting your own dominance? And if people are being honest, everybody has gotten into that angry standoff where it's like, it's not that I don't want to do it. It's that you asked me so rudely, I refuse. Whereas if the person would have just been, hey, Gabe, will you help me do something? Yeah, of course I'll stay late and help you do something. But you said that I had to stay late and that I was required to help you. I don't have to do anything. So even though I wouldn't have minded helping you, you were rude and condescending. So now I'm going home. People with bipolar disorder, they feel that way too. And oftentimes they feel that because of the bipolar disorder, they're less than. Remember, we've absorbed these messages. So they already are probably coming out with a fight. They already think that you look down on them and then you tell them what they need to do. There are many, many, many other nuances, hints, tips that I can give. But the last one that I give that I think really bears a lot of fruit is parents believe more often than not that they need to be the ones that fix this because it's their responsibility. And I love that about parents. I really do, for what it's worth, believe that that's one of the things that makes you a good mom and dad. You're like, my child is in trouble and I am going to save them. And I love that. But bipolar disorder is a lot bigger than you realize. If your house was consumed by fire and your child was trapped inside and a firefighter said, I'm going in to get your kid, you would not stop the firefighter and say, this is my decision. I'm going to go in and do it. Because you're not an expert on fire. You're not a first responder. You don't have any specialized equipment or training. So you would immediately know that your child's best odds of getting out of that fire are with that person. We need to start thinking that way about bipolar disorder. It is a 5-alarm fire. Do not think it is simple. And you may not be the best person to help your loved one. You may need to pass this off to an aunt, an uncle, a sibling, a friend, a grandparent. You may need to say, look, my son is not going to listen to me. He's not going to listen to me because I'm his mom, I'm his dad. You know what? But he'll listen to you because he loves his Aunt Linda. He'll listen to you because he loves his Uncle Jack. He'll listen to you because you're his baby sister. And have them do the talking and the partnering, and you take a less active role. You called 911. You got the firefighter there. You told the firefighter that your child was trapped in the back bedroom, which is through the front door, directly to the left and down the hall. You've done a lot. But at some point, you've got to realize that you need to step aside. And when it comes to mental illness, because of the stigma, the discrimination, and the shame, often parents take this all on their own. And unfortunately, they're ill-equipped to handle it, and bipolar disorder just literally consumes them like a fire because they thought it was something that they could handle. And I'm telling you, do not disrespect bipolar disorder. It is a massive illness that does vast amounts of damage to the person who is suffering from it and to families. And we need to give it that respect, or it's going to win.
Gabe, this is so powerful, and thank you so much for lending your expertise and your lived experience to this conversation. I started out by saying that I met this guy that's so authentic. So that's where we're going to wrap. Is your authenticity is incredible, and we so appreciate you so much. So thank you. And as we kind of wrap it up, let me just say to our audience, this has been Hope Starts With Us, a podcast by NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. If you are looking for mental health resources, you are not alone. To connect with the NAMI HelpLine and find local resources, visit nami.org/help. Text HelpLine to 62640 or dial 800-950-6264. To learn more about Gabe Howard's work, visit GabeHoward.com. To hear more from him about his experiences with bipolar disorder, you can listen to his podcast, Inside Mental Health and Inside Bipolar, available on your podcast platform. If you are experiencing an immediate suicide, substance use, or mental health crisis, please call or text 988 to speak with a trained support specialist, or visit 988lifeline.org. To learn how NAMI is engaging to expand crisis response services in conjunction with 988, visit reimaginecrisis.org. Thank you for listening, and we want you to be well.